Yes. Okay, it's done.
Okay. Merci Marie-Claire. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about one of my favorite topics. Before I begin showing you the PowerPoint presentation, and my presentation is going to take only 20 minutes and then I'm going to open it up to questions, I want to tell you a quick story. About 6 weeks ago, around the beginning of the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders in the US, I was talking to a coaching client of mine. He's a physician leader. He's a doctor who works on the East Coast in a major hospital. As you'd expect, we ended up talking about the coronavirus, but something he said really struck me, and it wasn't about the virus. It was about leadership. And what he said, and I'm quoting, is with all the work we have to do and the crisis in our halls and in our hospitals, it's hard to concentrate on leadership principles. Hard to concentrate on leadership principles in a crisis. So at the time, the hospitals all over the world and in the US were developing policies and procedures during times of crises. And in fact, some of the hospitals already had bad viruses. But I understood what my client meant. But what I wanted to point out was that it was precisely during these times of crisis, fear, uncertainty, that leaders must manifest excellent behaviors. Now more than ever, leadership, as you well know, is critical. As a leader, you are wearing more hats than ever. In other words, you are taking on more roles than ever right now. You are acting as boss, manager, leader, parent, spouse, colleague, friend. You're acting as people's coach, teacher, advisor, and yes, maybe a bit of a therapist. So what are some of these leadership principles that stand out during crises and after? This is exactly what we're going to talk about in the next 20 minutes. And these are just reminders of basic leadership principles with an emphasis on the behaviors that we should focus on now. So I'm going to share my presentation with you now. And going to show you the agenda. We're going to talk about what exactly is leadership anyway, leadership under stress, behaviors that drive success, accountability, and what's next. So let's begin with the definition of leadership. What exactly is a leader? It's someone who influences people to do things differently and voluntarily, the things that must be done. That's pretty simple. A leader influences people regardless of title or status. In other words, if your title is taken away, a measure of good leadership is whether people want to follow your influence. One of the things that I mentioned to my doctor client, the one I mentioned at the beginning, was that the same excellent leadership principles that apply in everyday life still apply during a crisis situation. However, we do need to exercise more self-control during a crisis because our strengths and weaknesses are typically magnified. So take a moment right now and think about your strengths and weaknesses. What kind of feedback have people given you when you're under stress? Are you more controlling? Are you more mean? Are you more bossy? The likelihood of these weaknesses showing up more is pretty high during a crisis. The behaviors that I'm describing today are based on a book I recently published called Leading the Way, Behaviors That Drive Success. And on this slide are the behaviors that are described in the book that drive leadership success. The ones in red are the ones I'm going to focus on today because they're the most relevant in times of crisis. They're self-control, empathy, personal stewardship, and communication. Let's begin with self-control, which in my opinion is one of the most important ones. So Plato said, the first and best victory is to conquer self. The best leaders exhibit self-control. You may be tired, you may be performing under stress, and you may have no patience for some of the things people are doing around you. Even so, it is imperative that as a leader, you exercise self-control when you actually want to blow up or crumble because of your emotions and anxiety. What I'm seeing at all levels of leadership right now is shared anxiety and worry. In other words, leaders not only feel responsibility for other people, they themselves have the same fears and anxieties as these people. Concerns about families, the economy, the state of the world, finances, and the list goes on. Plus, they have the concerns of their organizations, whether it's a multi-billion-dollar global organization or a small department with a handful of people. So you need to exhibit calm in the storm, understanding. If your tendency is to blow up, control it. Easier said than done, I do know that. You cannot control the pandemic. You cannot control the economy. You cannot control other people, but you can control your behavior. Go back to my first slide, our strengths and weaknesses. Remember, they are magnified under stress. What are yours and what will you control? Let me give you some suggestions in a second. This is a wonderful quote I like from one of my favorite authors, Kelly McGonigal, author of The Willpower Instinct. And it says, self-control is a better predictor of academic success and intelligence, a stronger determinant of effective leadership than charisma, and more important for marital bliss than empathy. So how do you exercise self-control? These are some suggestions. The 3-second rule is simply waiting 3 seconds before you react, especially now. 3 seconds may seem short, but it's a lifetime for some of us. Breathe in, breathe out, and wait for 3 seconds before you react to something that angers you, frustrates you, or scares you. WAIT, W-A-I-T, is an acronym for Why Am I Talking? It is a reminder to deliberately ask yourself before you speak why you are about to speak. For example, are you about to make a statement to prove a point or elevate someone or shame someone? Are you trying to clarify something? Is it even necessary for you to say anything? Think about what your intent is and be deliberate about projecting it. Great leaders are also confidential. People will be confiding in you about their anxieties. They're confiding in you about their families, their situations. You must really be discreet for their sake, your organization's sake, and for your own reputation as a leader. Refrain, do not talk about politics as much as possible. When people are scared and face uncertainty, as in now, it is natural for them to play the blame game. People are talking about local politics, international politics, and they're blaming people. Do not engage in those conversations. As a leader, remember that one of your jobs is to encourage calm and peace. Policies and procedures still apply. What do I mean by that? There is a tendency when things are not normal to feel that normal rules do not apply. It's like when you're on vacation and you let yourself indulge in things you would not typically do. Work priorities and projects may have shifted. People are working from home. Things are different. The best leaders I'm working with now are showing flexibility where and when possible to accommodate their people. But on the other hand, they are balancing flexibility with logic and rational thinking. Accountability is still important. The good leaders are still rewarding people for positive behaviors and good performance, and they are still administering constructive consequences for negative behavior. My firm, in addition to doing leadership development, partners with clients on human resources issues, and we've been called for HR questions even during this pandemic and crisis, normal ones. We've been asked questions related to what would seem business as usual, like performance issues, misbehaviors, and so on. So remember that some rules still apply. And self-control is all about being deliberate in what you control and what behaviors you want to project. The next thing I want to talk about is empathy. The ability to understand the emotional makeup, thoughts, and behaviors of other people. The ability to understand their thoughts and predict their behaviors. Do you want to know what one of the best secrets great leaders know? One of the big secrets that great leaders know is that leadership is not about them. Leadership is not about you. It's not about me. Leadership is about others. Your role, especially right now, is to be a servant leader, positively influencing others, removing barriers, making it easier for them to navigate their jobs and accomplish their goals. So in order to do this, you need to understand what others are going through and what they are thinking and feeling. That's a challenge if you are in charge of influencing many people because every person is different, right? Not everyone thinks the same way or thinks like you do. I'll give you an example. One of my clients thought she was doing a good thing by keeping the organization busy, quote unquote, busy during this pandemic. Her company is a large one with employees around the world, and everyone in the company started working virtually from home when the pandemic began to spread. The way this successful executive copes with unwanted emotions is by keeping herself busy. When she's worried or upset, she gets busy. So she thought, I will keep everybody busy so they'll be happier. She began assigning new projects to add to people's daily work. Guess what happened? Instead of helping people cope with fear and other emotions from COVID-19, she added to their stress level. And this behavior, acting like other people think the same way she did, hurt her reputation. People in the organization began saying things like, our executives are bored at home, or they have no clue what we're doing. As a leader, you are busy. You're trying to run a business. You're trying to influence people. You're dealing with your families at home. You're worried about the world economy. So how in the world do you increase your ability to read everybody's minds? Here are some tips. Just like the word for self-control is deliberate, the key phrase for empathy is slow down. Slow down your speech, your thoughts, in order to concentrate on what other people are saying. This sounds very simple. Listen without planning what you are going to say next. Listen with your ears, mind, and eyes. Don't presume you understand what the others are saying, what other people are saying. Check for understanding. You might say things like, okay, this is what I hear you saying. Am I correct in understanding that? Many of you work in global organizations with employees all around the world. Remember cultural differences. Remember that some of your people may have friends and relatives affected by the virus, some more than others in different parts of the world or the US. Also remember that different cultures internalize and express emotions differently. You as a leader have the responsibility of adapting to other people, not the other way around. So remember, it's not about you. You cannot think or say, well, if it were me, I would want this to be done this way. It's what about others want and what others feel. The other thing I want to talk about is accountability. As I mentioned earlier, it's not business as usual. You still need to hold people accountable. I know I just finished encouraging you to be understanding and compassionate, and now I'm going to recommend that you still hold people accountable, because I strongly believe that you can do so in a positive manner by communicating clear expectations early on, removing barriers and coaching people, tracking and measuring, giving honest feedback, and consistently administering consequences, both positive and corrective. We could spend hours on accountability itself during normal times and during crises, but we won't, not today, maybe another time. Personal stewardship is about taking care of yourself, mind, spirit, and body. Likewise, we could do a whole seminar on personal stewardship. I just want to remind you to take care of yourselves. I know it's hard to do, especially when you are in a frenzy, but you must. You can't take care of your people and your work and your families if you don't take care of your own physical and emotional needs first. This next slide is a visual reminder. It's a three-legged stool. If one leg of a three-legged stool becomes weak or breaks off, the whole stool falls or breaks and crumbles. So make an extra effort during a crisis as a leader to take control of your mind, spirit, and body. Communication. I love this quote because it is so true. The problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. In my work, I so often act as interpreter and translator for people simply because people do not understand each other and not because of a foreign language. During a crisis, and I know you know this, communication is invaluable. Remember that it should be frequent, clear, authentic, and direct. During uncertainty and crises, it has been proven that transparent and frequent communication facilitates great business and great leadership. What does this mean to you? It means actually repeating yourself often, and touching base with your people, not just in Zoom meetings with multiple people, but one-on-one as well. It means going back to empathy and understanding what each person's needs are and you adapting to them. So you may have some people who don't want to be bothered by you for a while and others who need daily touching base. Communication is even more difficult to do when you're leading or managing virtually because communication is a two-way dynamic. It is one person doing the communicating and the other receiving the communication. It is much easier to understand people if you can see their body language. In fact, studies have shown that 75 to 90% of understanding of communication is derived from body language. So pay particular attention if you are leading virtually. It is imperative that you use all the leadership skills I mentioned earlier in order to have effective communication. Self-control, empathy, accountability, and yes, personal stewardship so that you are mentally and physically healthy and available to everyone. So what's next? Needless to say, business around the world has changed. You've heard about the potential for new normal. What is it going to be like? As you phase back into more normal work behavior, remember that some people around the world have been emotionally and physically affected by this pandemic. Some may experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They have anxiety, worry, grief. Grieving may be because of the loss of loved ones and friends due to the virus, or it could be grieving an old life that felt more secure. If your business can afford it, offer EAP, employee assistance programs with therapists. Some people will come back to work with alcoholism, anxiety, worry about finances, and other issues. A recent survey conducted by Fishbowl, which is a social network, questioned nearly 13,000 workers in all 50 states in the US. It noted that people are drinking much more alcohol during the day while working from home. I'm sure that's no surprise to you. There have also been reports of overdosing on drugs. So be patient. Some of your employees will want a vacation. Others will need time off to catch up on things they haven't been able to do that seem trivial to you. For example, haircuts, car inspections, doctor's visits. After experiencing work from home, some people did it successfully and are much more productive. They enjoyed the flexibility and freedom from working at home. You will see an increase in demand for virtual work, and if you do not allow it, you may want to reconsider changing the way work is done in your organization if you can afford to do that. One executive told me that he can't wait for business as usual, and he said, "No one better ask me for a vacation anytime soon." That's the wrong approach. Be patient, be understanding, know what your people need, all the while balancing the need for business results, of course. The best leaders understand the need for results as well as relationships. So in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the same leadership principles apply during a crisis, that your strengths and weaknesses are magnified, and that these are the behaviors that drive success. Pay special attention to self-control, empathy, personal stewardship, and communication. And I wish you all the best of luck. And hopefully we are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions.
All right. Okay. All right, thank you, Paulette. I have a few questions here. Sorry, my computer, my other screen went blank. All right, so the first question is, you mentioned accountability and compassion. How can you have a compassionate conversation with someone who is not performing but is suffering because of the coronavirus?
Good question. There's so much wrapped up in this issue, and the answer is, it depends. So much depends on your communication and demeanor when you're doing it. So the first thing I will say is that you must have the conversation in the first place, or else the misbehavior or bad performance will build on itself and snowball. I had an example of exactly this scenario a few weeks ago during the crisis. One of my clients called and said he had to address issues he was hearing from other people about one of his managers. And he asked me this very question. The first step is to gently express what the issue is, more gently than usual. So for example, you might say, John, can we talk for a moment? I want to give you some feedback. Or I am hearing, or you can say, I have noticed. Address the issue clearly and completely. And then here is where the compassion comes in. Ask why things aren't getting done or why the behavior is what it is. Don't assume you know. Don't just jump to the conclusion that there's a misbehavior because it's just there. It sounds simple, of course, but you would be surprised how many people don't take the step of asking why. They just assume that something isn't being done or behavior is bad and they want to stop it. So they think, okay, I'm going to address it, tell them what it is, and tell them to stop it. Then listen to the answer. Again, many leaders are going so quickly that they're forgetting to stop and listen. Remember what we talked about earlier about empathy and slowing down? So in this example, the client approached his manager in this way and learned about some very important things he didn't know about in the department. And he was able to address them in the situation, and it was corrected.
Thank you. Another question. A lot of people, especially in Europe, are expecting fundamental changes in business and society, environment, supply chain, local sourcing, etc. After the pandemic is behind us, how do you think leaders can drive this change when we tend to go back to normal, between quotes?
I missed the last part. How can leaders what?
So how do you think leaders can drive this change when we tend to go back to normal?
Very good question. I would say leaders the great leaders are also very good about asking for help. So if you are one of those leaders, surround yourself with people who are also thinking about implications for the future and be very deliberate. This is part of strategic thinking. So keep in mind that all of this is changing and surround yourself with people who can help you and be deliberate in your strategy. You cannot do it alone.
All right, thank you.
And one more thing. I don't think the people will allow you to get back to normal completely very quickly. They will talk and they will ask you and tell you what they need. So the other point is listen very carefully.
Okay. Another one from Frédéric Gresset. I noticed reference to global intelligence and acting in your slides. Could you please elaborate on these concepts?
Thank you for that question, Frédéric. Global intelligence is something that great leaders have, and it's the awareness of events and situations outside our day-to-day activities and local influence. It gives us a broader perspective and makes us better leaders. It's essentially the act of pursuing knowledge you need to understand people and cultures around the world. You've heard that the world is flat, the earth is flat kind of philosophy. It makes you more effective as a leader and increases your empathy. So it's the ability to understand and know how people are thinking around the world. Great leaders are very high in global intelligence.
Okay.
Acting, I believe you asked about acting as well. Okay. Yes. So I know this may sound controversial, but the best leaders in the world are also great actors. And I don't mean like Hollywood actors. I mean, they understand that their behavior impacts everybody around them and their reputation. And they know how to behave appropriately. So acting is like behaving. And in my book, I dedicate the whole last chapter of the book on acting. You do it all the time anyway, in a genuine way. So, for example, if you are tired or sick and you still go to work and act as if things are normal, you're acting, and it's very appropriate. It has to do with the self-control I mentioned earlier. and requires the acting skills. Thank you, Frédéric.
All right, thank you. So from Ralph Terrio, should I care about the method or the results or both during this time?
Very good question. Absolutely about both. There is a graph that I love that has relationships on one axis and results on the other. And the best leaders are in the upper right-hand quadrant because they focus on relationships and results. And relationships have a lot to do with the methods. Results may have to do with the processes. The best leaders are capable of balancing both. Very good question.
All right, thanks. From Anna Lothpeich, I don't know how to pronounce the name.
Lothpeich?
Oh, okay, other than effectively communicating, how will a leader be challenged by managing virtual teams?
Very good question. Time management and watching for the nuances. When you are in front of people, as I mentioned, most of communication, good communication is derived through the nonverbal. So when you are in front of somebody, you can actually read their minds a little better. You can see from their body language. So that is a huge challenge in virtual communication. For example, I'm talking to all of you, but I can't see you. I cannot see what your expressions are. So when you're having Zoom meetings and phone calls, you have to slow down even more so to pick up on the nuances of virtual leadership.
Yeah, great, good point. I mean, one thing I've noticed is that you never see the hands of people.
That's right.
You know, and that's often very indicative of their nervousness or something. So
I speak a lot with my hands, and I'm having to control them now because I know if I move them a lot, you're just going to see my upper body moving. So yeah, new challenges.
Exactly. Thank you. So from John Schultz, do you have any thoughts on staff engagement and keeping a strong connection with followed employees?
With what employees?
Followed employees.
Engagement and connection. Again, it has to do with communication. And I'm not sure if your people are, I suspect, John, because of your business, they are actually there and they're not all virtual. You have to be more present as a leader during a crisis. That's all it takes basically to get them more engaged. Of course, all the proper leadership behaviors, but the biggest thing is being more present. So if you're walking around talking to people, thanking them a lot, if it's virtual, touching base with them, making phone calls, and not just waiting for Zoom meetings. I have some clients who are very good at that. They're calling, they have a list of people they call every day, and they rotate the people just to touch base. That's how you keep them engaged and listen.
So even the followed employees, I mean, what would you do? Would there be something specific to do for those? I mean,
you mean the people who are following you, or
followed? Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. Followed, you know, like they're on the sort of chômage technique. They're not working now, but you will.
I'm sorry,
followed. Sorry, it's me.
That's okay. I understood followed.
Oh no, followed.
Oh yes, that's a great question. Keep them engaged by keeping them involved in all communication you have. If you do intend bringing them back, please do involve them in communication and check on them, text them, call them, make sure that they know that you care about them and you want them to come back.
Great. Maybe a group,
I got it.
a group email, maybe sometimes from time to time. Yes, something. Okay, from Karen Brosius. Hey, Karen. My question is around work hours from home. They seem now very blurred and people seem to be working around the clock. What are the best approaches to keeping sane? Good question.
That's a very good question. And I relate to it completely because I have a small business and a home office and I work from home all the time. If you are the one doing it, I'm going to talk about it from two perspectives. If you're the leader of people doing it and if you are doing it. If you're doing it, it's a matter of discipline and putting boundaries for yourself and knowing when to stop. That, you know, goes without saying. If you are the leader of people doing that, make sure that they understand that it's okay to get off their computers at a certain time. And the way you do that also is, it's very important to have good measures of results. That's one way you can control and work, virtual work, or even in the workplace. If you know what you're measuring and people are accomplishing what they need to do, then let them know it's okay to sign off and take some time off. But the key is measure and track. If you don't have those processes and systems, if you have soft ways of knowing what people are doing, then try to be a little more disciplined, come up with great measures, because it'll free you up. It'll liberate people if they know that, okay, the boss knows what I'm doing and I'm doing well, then they're okay taking time off.
Would you recommend, for example, and I've noticed, and I'm guilty of this also, and a lot of people do that, maybe if you want your employees to have more sane hours, etc., not send emails at midnight, or
to act
would
as
that
an
be
example.
a recommendation also, so that they don't feel that they have to respond at all hours?
Very good point. In fact, I tell some people, if you want to set an example, don't do it yourself. But if you have to, because of your circumstances, and you absolutely want to do it, make sure they understand that you don't expect the same. But you're right, do set an example.
Okay. From Kathy Burns, excellent perspective and reminders, Paulette. Always great to okay, sorry.
Thank
So
you, Kathy.
she's just, yeah, I'm sorry. All right. And Ralph Terrio, is it okay to change the tracking and measures during this time if you have not been doing it that way in the past?
Absolutely. It's a new time, times of crisis. In fact, as long as they make sense, if your tracking and measuring changes make sense for what you're doing, absolutely. And it's a great time to begin. In fact,
do you have any recommendations on what good ways of doing this when everything's virtual?
It really depends on the job and what, some people are project managers and they have projects and they have milestones in the project.
Okay. Can you talk about organizations' mission and values during the crisis?
Yes, this is a great opportunity. Just like some people will focus more on measuring and tracking and doing things that they wish they had always done. Some organizations are spending more time on their mission and vision and values. It's important to relook at those. And to make sure that they are complying with what you need. Are the behaviors during crises actually validating what your mission, vision, and cultural competencies are? And if they're not, if people are behaving in completely different ways, then you may want to revisit them, because your values, your leadership competencies, your corporate culture, written statements ought to reflect not only things during normal times, but also during crises. For example, I'm going to use a really easy one, integrity. Many organizations have integrity as a competency. And it's sometimes that they think it's easier to do during normal times, but when there's a crisis, they might, bend the rules a little bit. So you really need to be conscious about what people are doing, what your behavior is like, and is it consistent with your cultural values? Okay. And if you don't have any, this may be a good time to come up with them.
Another one, can you elaborate on accountability? It's very hard to do it under normal circumstances. How about during a crisis?
I'm glad you asked that. My next book is on positive accountability, because I believe very strongly that you can do it. And a lot of people, if you're not doing it properly, you're in good company, because most people struggle with accountability. They either are too nice or they're too mean. They either don't want to have the confrontational conversations, or they act like jerks, and that's not good either. So accountability is a 5-step process, in my opinion. It starts with communicating the clear expectations that you want of people in an interactive way with no surprises. Then you assist people. You remove barriers and you coach them. You give them authority. You give them training, the budgets. Then you track and measure. We talked about tracking and measuring, because without one of these steps, it's hard to hold people accountable. When you track and measure, focus on the positives, positive accountability. Don't just pick the things that people aren't doing well. Don't just point out the negatives or the mistakes. You can do both. And of course, provide the feedback in a very timely manner. And then do administer consequences. And consequences aren't just negative. They are positive consequences. You can reward people in so many ways. And if you have to give negative consequences, do it in a constructive way. So to me, accountability is a loop. And it's a multi-step process, and it's very hard to do properly if you skip a step, if you miss one of the steps.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Lydie from Lydie Surget. How to motivate members of a non-profit association to continue its mission in this crisis?
Oh, very, very good question.
Mm-hmm.
When I get questions about motivating groups of people, I typically tell the leader to break down the group by individuals and figuring out what motivates each individual. Our first tendency is to have a group meeting and act as a cheerleader and say, this is what we're going to do, everything's fine, or we're in trouble and we need to do this. That is sometimes effective, but I would strongly encourage you pick some of the people you really need and talk to them individually. And this is where empathy comes in. Remember, the understanding what motivates each person, what their needs are, how they're thinking. And if you can tap into each person's internal, intrinsic motivation, then you can motivate them, and then the whole group becomes motivated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great. Sandy Martin, as bad as the virus crisis has been, what, in your opinion, is the biggest silver lining that has emerged from this experience?
Wow, what a great question. And I'm going to answer it not just from a business perspective from my clients and colleagues, but also from personal friends. I think people have slowed down. You know, I mentioned slowing down a bit in empathy and in other parts of this presentation. They've become introspective. Some people know a little more what they want. And some of them are planning on telling you as leaders what they want when they get back to work. Also, the virtual work has been really incredibly, it's been done well. And where some organizations were hesitant about letting people work from home, I think they're going to be more open to it. And I say it's positive because productivity goes up. Now, there was a question earlier about people working at all hours of the day and night. Not good for them, but it's good for productivity and for the organizations if they're controlled well and people don't burn out. So, and it's also better for transportation. People aren't commuting, they're saving time. And so there are so many positives. I think it's the slowdown and it's the introspection, actually, and rethinking goals and objectives of both businesses and personal goals.
I mean, I wanted to add this. I mean, I've personally found that there is more communication within organizations. It seems that, you know, this pushes us, the fact of not seeing people in person pushes us to communicate more with them. I mean, that's,
Sure.
I think that's happened more. So I think that's the end of our questions. And oh, no. Oh, and thank you from a lot of people. But I think that's the end of the questions. I mean, would you have anything else to add, maybe, as a conclusion?
No, I want to thank you all for joining me during your lunch hour or beyond. And thank you. These were great questions. I really appreciate them. And it was a pleasure.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Paulette. It was a great pleasure to have you talk to us. We hope to have you more in the future. To everybody, I remind you that Paulette has written a book about, you know, behaviors that leading the way, behaviors that drive success, where you probably find a lot of information and all these more developed. And I'm sure we can ask you more questions. And this webinar will be posted on our website, and we will send a link to the webinar to all the attendees. Thank you very much, Paulette. Have a great day and be safe, everybody. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.